Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to a new season of Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime is a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and many other officers on campus, which celebrates learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. Past Primetime presentations, including past seasons, are available in the BU Digital Library, which can be found on the library's homepage. Tuesday, November 11th, Dr. Susan Brooks will be presenting a Talk About Teaching presentation about her revelation that endeavoring to become a better distance instructor revolutionized her face-to-face classes in her presentation, How I Became a Better Teacher, period, by teaching online. Today we welcome BU's Digital Library Manager, Kent Gerber, as he presents What are the Digital Humanities? What are they doing in the liberal arts and at Bethel? Let's welcome Kent this morning.
All right, thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
So first of all, as the digital library manager, I have worked a lot with Bethel's unique resources like the scholarship and cultural heritage. And so I've been doing a little slice of the digital humanities, but I really wanted to paint a broader picture of what the digital humanities are in a lot of contexts, so different institutions, different situations. So and I've really been exploring it a little bit, but I'm also presenting this as sort of a co-explorer and sort of want to present a little bit more broader picture to you, but I also would like to hear a little bit of your thoughts too, if we can get to that. But today I'll just talk a little bit about what is and are the digital humanities, and I do that with fear and trembling because the definition itself is a very contested situation. So I'll just present some different ideas that others have used. We can talk about that, and then just a brief history of there's a lot of it that's old, but there's also a lot of digital humanities that are new, and so we'll talk a little bit about why that is, and then some current projects as examples, and some specifics about why it's useful or helpful in the liberal arts, and then some tools and some communities that are involved. So let's get started. So what are the digital humanities? So an official definition that shows up, there's a variety of definitions that show up in different places, but essentially they have these two aspects. One, scholars using computing technologies to investigate the kind of questions that are traditional to the humanities. So basically using computers to do humanities stuff. And then secondly, and then also to ask traditional kinds of humanities-oriented questions about computing technologies. So critiquing what's the effect of computers and digital technologies on society and ourselves. And so this is Kathleen Fitzpatrick is a voice that, if you haven't heard of her, she's a person who will speak about digital humanities quite often, like on Prop Hacker. And also, this definition is also the National Endowment for the Humanities uses this definition for their grant project. So if you apply for a grant for the Office of Digital Humanities, this is the kind of definition they'll be working under. So there typically tend to be two camps in digital humanities, and one is the digital humanities, is it a discipline or is it not? So that's one argument. The other is digital humanities, it's methodological, or like if you are not making or building something, you are not a digital humanist. So that's one sort of extreme camp. Then there's the other, on the other extreme here, which is sort of the critique, or if you're just doing methodology or if you're just doing technique, there's no theory involved. So there's the critique from that end. And then you have a lot of in between, people who are building things and critiquing all at the same time. So that's one way of thinking about it. Also, the first group also tends to be one of the older groups in that it primarily involves encoding and working with digital text. There's also a four typology process, or way people look at it. So that type 1 methodological, similar to this number 1, the direct practical uses of computational methods for research. And that's the kind of stuff that also shows up in research institutions, the larger ones that you might see, the larger international or broader projects. And then that type 2 sounds familiar, media studies, studying the new media, so internet as network computing, as that evolves, video and audio. Then there's also these two additional ones, but using technology in the classroom and basically focusing on pedagogy. And then the fourth one is the new way technologies reshaping research in the profession. So a platform shift, a shift in society, a shift in how we use and understand information. So here's an example of sort of that type 1. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln has a Walt Whitman archive. And so archiving texts and putting them all together, that's not necessarily new, but what is newer is that the archive itself has the text encoded so that you can actually see Walt Whitman working with his manuscripts. So here's the markup, and that they worked out ways to encode it on the computer so that you can actually see how he marked it up. But then you can also see the actual original manuscript. So it's kind of cool. You can kind of see how Walt Whitman worked, get a sense of how he even self-edited. And so traditional work would have been looking at this and analyzing this, but then what makes it more new is actually encoding it in so that computers can understand what this markup looks like and what it means, even semantically, and not even just display, but for the semantic meaning of it. So that's an example of one. So then the type 2, you have non-textual, and so this is an example of, at the University of Minnesota, they have a visualization lab, and they've actually studied acoustics and what would these ancient Roman or Greek forums, actually how would they have been configured, and how would people have been able to hear them? So basically they've done acoustical research, like how loud would the person have to speak? How much space would it have to be to actually set it up, and then they've recreated the environment. So that's sort of non-textual or outside of text, an example. Then you also have more of a theoretical or critique. Digital ethnography. This is Michael Wesch at Kansas State University is doing some really innovative stuff, both with media ecology and critiquing. So he's actually done a lot of research and included his students in it to critique and look at YouTube, the anthropology of YouTube. And also just critiquing like how students learn. So you may have seen this video. This went around quite a while ago, but anybody noticed this one yet? It's the students, that open up their laptops and say, I Facebook most of my classes. How much of this class has any immediate meaning for me, or what am I going to use? So Michael Wesch was the one who did this. If you're familiar with it, and if you aren't. He also uses Google Docs and includes students in it to collaborate. So he's both interesting as a media ecology and a person who's a critique, but also he includes students in a lot of his work, which is also appropriate for liberal arts, even though he's at a state institution. He really focuses on teaching. All right, so a brief history. So digital humanities is a somewhat new term, but actually it used to be called humanities computing, based on this sort of really textual work. So the father or the originator of the discipline or the practice, if you will, is Father Roberto Busa. He compiled all of St. Thomas Aquinas' works, and he started working on punch cards. But eventually it became digitized and is now available online. But he created a concordance, and it's not just a concordance based on word searches, but he actually compiled what they call lemma, or some linguistics, but all the variations of a word that would be used. So it's in Latin as well, but all the variations of a word in Latin that you would want to find, you can search for that, and it will pull it up throughout. So not just the word, but all the variations of the words. And then in the 70s, the Association for Computers and the Humanities was founded, and sort of these linguists, literary critics got together. They later founded a listserv which served as an early journal. And then 1990s, the Text Encoding Initiative, which was how do we actually have a standard for encoding these texts in the humanities, so literary, linguistics, all sorts of stuff. So if you actually, like the Walt Whitman Archive actually works on this standard, so that's what it's based on. So here are some different examples. I'll just pull up the Perseus Digital Library is considered one of the granddaddies of digital libraries. And it has all sorts of Greek and Roman texts, and it includes a lot of encoding. So if you're ever doing any classics research or anything like that, this is And it's encoded. There's some mapping processes you can go through if you click on this. Again, like I was saying, the variations of the words and the variations of references to this are all encoded into that, so that it won't just search the word, it searches the concept. So. Oh, and just another early one, Women Writers Project, compiled a bunch of women writers, and then Valley of the Shadow with these primary sources during the Civil War. We compiled them together to tell the story of these people who lived in that area. All right, so starting in 2001, this book over here is sort of credited with changing the terminology from humanities computing to digital humanities, and that's where it actually broadened. So up to this point, it was more of these textual, digital texts, large corpuses of text. But this book, when they were putting out a companion to humanities computing, and they decided it would sound better to be digital humanities. But they also wanted to broaden the practice to include those type 2s in the critiques. And then as that followed, the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, it included some of those older organizations, but it's a global and international umbrella of all of them. And it puts out some publications. The Digital Humanities Quarterly is published by the Alliance. And then NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, actually founded the Office of Digital Humanities in 2006. So, you get grant funding, the name gets more important as you go. And then in 2007, the Journal of Digital Humanities was founded. So you start to see that enter. So a lot of the different kinds of works, one of the things that are, this isn't prescriptive, but most of them really are characterized by being participatory and publicly available. So most of them really allow people to contribute and are openly available. They're not copyrighted, they're not for pay, although there are some. It's also very collaborative, so it invites the public, but it also invites different disciplines to collaborate together. So a computer scientist is finding a large corpus of text to work with, and so those two will get together. And then the importance of design, so not just putting together material, but really how is it going to be usable, and how will it work well for people. So for instance, even with the internet didn't really blow up until the graphical browser took off in the mid-90s. So then that was when more people started it. And that also explains why digital humanities, maybe if you haven't heard it before, it's become more prevalent because the tools of digital humanities are a lot more accessible. They're a lot more usable to most people because of the graphics and because of the usability. So here's some other just smaller samples of what kinds of things, and you may recognize this in your discipline. The other thing about digital humanities, it could be centered in a discipline, but it also could be an interdisciplinary class. So each of your disciplines may have a digital component to digital art, digital English. But these are some sort of larger trends that are sort of going across disciplines and across institutions. So we'll go into one, digital music and ethnography. And this is a great example to start with because I don't know if some of you were here for the Edgar Scholars presentation or saw their work. So Stephen Self and Grant Akron. Well, this is a great example because it includes a lot of things. It includes the whole fact that they were able to do this kind of research was because the library in Italy, the Biblioteca Estensa d'Italia, forgive my Italian, I don't know it, but they made this, the manuscript that they were able to look at available. It's globally available, and they also included a license. They intended it to be shared. So a Creative Commons license was included. So the fact that Dr. Self and Grant were able to do their research was because this was enabled. So normally they would have had to travel to Italy. They would have had to make a copy of this really rare manuscript. So that's sort of the foundation there. But then secondly, their actual work was to take a look at that, to analyze it, to transcribe the music into modern notation, and actually to transfer it into a computer code so that the computer could perform and understand it. And then they had to analyze it, sort of, what does that say about that time period? What does it say about the music of the time? And so I think this is a great example, and it also, another example of liberal arts, it includes the student and the teacher working together. And sort of participating in these larger projects. So you don't necessarily have to build a lot of things, but you can build small things, so you can interact in small ways. But actually, Grant presented at a musicology conference, and so he was one of the only undergrads, I think, that they said in this presentation. So there's some more current projects just to go through. And there's a lot of examples, but digital storytelling in journalism. So this is probably the best example. The New York Times did this story on an avalanche, and so it includes the story. but it also includes these graphics, multimedia, and so you have these oral histories and videos that are incorporated into the story. You have, this is one of my favorite parts, but sort of where in the mountains did this happen? So, and thanks to Betsy pointed this one out to me, so thanks, Betsy. Images. So different ways to tell the story, to add to the text and add to the context. Also, if you, because of time I'll go through, but University of Minnesota did something called Immigrant Stories, and they have a page, and they actually interviewed all these different students, and what was their experience like being viewed, either first-generation students, and it includes some Hmong, some Italian families, some all sorts of different. So I think this is actually a great resource just to even learn about our own community, the larger community. This example here in the liberal arts class, I know history has done this, but some others, they actually used a WordPress blog and allowed students to upload short little digital stories. And based on their reflection of going around the campus, they even mapped and they plotted their different reflections and journals and images on the map. And if you have a chance to look at Bethel, we'll get, we got to keep moving. So, I just wanted to point out, so digital archives are a piece of that. So that's what I'm most versed with, because I'm working with that every day. But there are some examples of the Digital Public Library of America actually as a way to get museums, libraries, archives all across the United States to contribute together into a larger body of work that's easier to find. There's a World Digital Library, which Library of Congress has contributed materials to, but other libraries around the world. This image is from the Wellcome Library in London, which is sort of the history of medicine. And there's just so many libraries and museums have these rich resources of our visual and our culture available for free. So that's. So here's another example of a publication, the Codex Sinaiticus is one of the earliest complete Bibles, as I understand it. And it's actually a project. These four institutions, the British Library, the National Library of Russia, St. Kate's Catholic Monastery, and the Leipzig University, they have 4 different pieces of the Codex. Nobody has the whole piece. But through digitally, they're able to put it all together and present it as a whole. And they even have, it's encoded so people can look for these different manuscript pieces and different portions throughout it. Local example of a digital archive, we have the Permanent Art Collection in George Townsend in the Digital Library, so check that out. It's really fun. An example of text mining and visualization. So this is a small one, but taking the text of the Clarion, you basically take the OCR text, the text file, put it into, how many people use Wordle? I think it's a tool online, you just plug in text and it will, by the amount, how many times the word occurs, they will make it larger and do different colors. But one of the things about digital humanities is you can actually analyze these larger bodies of text or bodies of work for patterns. And so this is an example of the visualization, like, is there a pattern in here? So it was about Bethel, it was about the president, it was about the new president. So how can you sort of see and identify patterns? And that's one of the things that's new. If you've heard close reading, which is like reading one book at a time, then there's this thing called distant reading, which is like looking at these large corpus of text and setting up computer algorithms to search these texts for patterns. And so that's another way that you can do sort of, but what's new about the digital humanities, you can find these patterns and present them in an interesting way. This is really fun, and actually credit to our director, David Stewart. This tool called Bookworm, it looks into these different corpus of text, so the Open Library, the archive, which is like sort of physics, and Chronicle America's historical newspapers, but the best thing about this, in my opinion, is that they've also taken 25 years of The Simpsons transcripts, and you can search for trends and themes. So they had Maud, but I was interested in where does donut show up, how often. So that's the blue one, and you can even see in the context of, hey, Hansel, pull up a donut and sit down. So that's what's here. So, it can be serious stuff, but it can also be pretty fun. So pop culture and hype. So thanks, David. That was good. This is also kind of fun. Another way of information visualization, and just another way to get at a lot of complex information. So this is a project out of Yale, and what they've done is they've compiled all these photographs that the federal government did between 35 and 45, just going around the U.S. and documenting just the life of people there. And so like Dorothea Lange and Percy Walker, some of these famous photographers, were a part of this project. And so they've compiled them and archived them, and then they've also provided ways you can look at them really interestingly. So you can look at the map of the U.S. and then how many pictures are from that era or that place. But then there's another way they had that you could actually get at the data. But scholarly publishing has also changed. That's sort of number 4. How quickly can you get stuff out? And how can you also still include peer review, but also get material out, get people access to what's being learned, what's being researched. And so actually Mark Bruce, if you saw that announcement, this is the journal that he's editing. And so they've covered digital humanities, but also one of the points that they put in publishing this journal, so it's an interdisciplinary academic journal whose goal is to invigorate humanities discourse by publishing brief, peer-reviewed reports and with a fast turnaround. So that's one of the things enabled by digital technologies with peer review and the process for the material to get out faster. This is an example, so we looked at a journal, but this is an example of a book. It was originally published in print in 2012, but it's after a year, they made sure that the publisher agreed that they could put it as an open access book. And so that makes it interesting to begin with. But also, not only is it just a text online, it's actually interactive. So you can go in and you can mark sections that you find interesting, and they will compile how many people have found that interesting. You can also add comments, and then they are actually updating the website. So based on the interaction, this discourse that's happening around the book, they're actually updating versions. So Mike Holmes' Greek New Testament text would be considered a digital humanities project. It's critically edited, it's really available, and they've also included the way that the text is encoded. It's exchangeable, it can be on different people's computers. They've really intended for that to happen. Another thing is crowdsourcing and student engagement. But has anybody heard of Ancient Lives or Zooniverse? That's how some people have. So actually, Zooniverse is all sorts of different aspects of citizen science. So all people who are doing these research projects and want help, and people who don't necessarily need to be experts. So Ancient Lives is one of these projects, and people can basically go in, and with a little bit of training, you just read a couple blocks of this, and then you can point out characters and then identify which one you think it is. And through that work, they've done actually thousands of years of work through just letting people come in and do this. The cool thing about Zooniverse, it's actually kind of fun to play because there's one new thing. So there are these different categories, but in the humanities, so there's Ancient Lives, but also there's a new one with soldiers' war diaries, and you can mark those up and find out about that. Climate, there's one thing called Old Weather, but it's ship's logs, and their point is that there's actually a lot of places in the world that don't have data about the weather patterns, and so through the ship's logs, you can transcribe them and add data and create knowledge. And this is stuff that your students could do if you want to set it up in your class. You can have them interact with a real research project. This one is, it started in Cleveland State, and they created it, and they've mapped different plots, and it's pictures, it's audio, it's video, reflections on different places around Cleveland, but also it was created to tell stories, use the city as a layer and tell the story of the city. But it was also created to share, and so there's St. Paul Historical, there's Minneapolis Historical. Anybody who takes that on can actually start a project, use this software to create their own project. Another example, virtual museums. If anybody's seen the Google Art Project or the Cultural Institute, they have ways you can at least, you can sort of see what the galleries look like, and it has a limited amount of items that you can actually see up close, which is a very, very neat experience to go through. Rome Reborn is one of the older digital humanities projects, but it's also really, has anybody seen this one before? It's actually, they've done research on what would Rome have been like at the time they recreated it. So, with as much sort of scholarly study as they can. So this is as accurate as they try to get it. So through 3D modeling, through humanities research, they've been able to recreate what Rome would have looked like back in the day. They even have people moving around later. So fascinating. And they have their own version here, so Sam and Chris. And they've been, even in some of the videos they've been creating for their courses, I mean, they've done several things that we can sort of recognize as digital humanities and teaching. There's also the concept of maker spaces, including things like 3D printers. But the maker spaces are sort of spaces where people come to make things both with computer tools, but also physical tools. So like sometimes they include hammers and welding, and but 3D printers are interesting as far as you can actually create models of. You can create a model of the Roman Colosseum if you wanted to look at it up close. Or anything you can sort of create a 3D model of, there's software out there and you could actually print it out. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. We'll probably have a presentation later this year about that. So the Scholars Lab is a place at the University of Virginia. They've been doing a lot of work in digital humanities. So if you haven't heard of them, they're really a prototype, and they've done a lot of work. They're actually really, and Bethany Novitsky is a person who's really prominent in this. So what is digital? We've spoken a little bit about liberal arts where you might see these, but I just wanted to include this text. This is a person who's the director of the Center for Digital Learning and Research in Occidental College, which is a liberal arts school. And sort of why do they do it? It's that faculty and students use digital resources to pose new questions, discover and create knowledge in distributed and collaborative ways, work with scholars and information globally without physically leaving campus, and simultaneously gather and share data in the field. So kind of some of the things I've been trying to mention here. This is a pattern, and you have to think about what works best at Bethel, but there are ways that work good. And so one thing I wanted to mention, sort of in the context of liberal arts, so the scaffolded approach. So some of these projects are big and very complicated, so we might not have the resources to do that even as a whole institution. However, relatively simple to start using some of these tools, and I'm sure most of you have used some of these in some ways. Or you can ask a simple question, and then as you learn more, you might be able to contribute to that sort of project a little bit more. Or you might be able to answer some questions. Yeah. And then up there, if you can actually build your own tool or do some significant work to build a new tool project or ask a new question based on it. So if you wanted to get started, this is something that there's a whole list of digital humanities syllabi that people are sharing. So if you wanted to see how is your discipline or how are others including this kind of stuff in their teaching, this is one way to look at it. I have links to that. This is one project. Dan Ritchie and I worked together just to create sort of a group project in one of his early English classes. And so this is kind of an example of visualization. Basically, the students just had to, each group had a Google spreadsheet that they populated. And then that data was shown on this timeline, which I created, Dan and I created together. So here's just an example of, based on what the students did in their group, they found information about the title, they learned a little bit about, and the context was, they had to learn about a poet. and they had to look at their lives and the context of their life and find resources that demonstrated what they learned. And you can embed video, audio, different images. So that's just an example of what they did. And you can even narrow it to certain themes, just the things that have to do with biography. So, where are these kinds of activities happening? So, a lot of them, they're distributed throughout campuses or throughout departments. So, a lot of institutions, and I suspect a lot of more people at Bethel might be doing some things like this, but we just don't know about it. So. And then there are other places that are more centralized, so they have either an online spot. This place is called DH Commons, which is they actually list people's expertise. They also list projects, and then people gather together and collaborate together. So it just looks like this. And people basically put up a bulletin board. This is the project I want to work on. These are the kind of skills I might need and the disciplines I need. And then people kind of gather this. And then also there's the physical components, or sort of digital community centers that have sort of computers and resources and materials that whatever people might want to make. And then also, if you really are curious, you want to find out more. Digital Humanities now is kind of like a newspaper magazine format, so they publish what kinds of projects people are working on all across the nation. And then if you actually want more of a meatier treatment or sort of a theoretical or critical treatment, you have the Journal of Digital Humanities, and there's the Digital Humanities Quarterly. Another example of some of these digital humanities centers. So the Scholars Lab in the University of Virginia is a really big one. If you haven't, the Center for History and New Media also has created tools and is doing a lot of innovative projects. A lot of the stuff that we're hearing about for digital humanities is coming out of the work that's coming out of here. This one's the University of Birmingham in the UK. The Codex Sinaiticus is actually a project that was facilitated through this center. So it's something to know about. Here's an example of one at a more traditional liberal arts college, Hamilton College. And so this, if you wanted to look at this, there's some architectural drawings and some examples of how they created a space, as well as what happens around that space. Running out of time, but this is an example of another liberal arts institution. And they talk about another thing. So they analyze the different Homer manuscripts. So how do they vary? Because there's so many different versions. And so this project actually looks at the compare the versions of the text. Yeah. But then the students get involved in that, and another thing is it's a process over the project. So again, another piece of liberal arts is learning, it's engaging, getting a sense of what it's like to do the real work later, if you will. All right, and some other, if you want to look at the Messiah colleges, has had a lot of activities around PhD. If you want to take a look, John Fay's blog is a good example of that. Closer to home, St. Olaf McAllister and Carleton received a grant in 2012, and they're doing a lot of work in developing digital humanities projects. So one example, just a cool one, I know this is one of Sam's favorites, but this professor at St. Olaf found a computer science person who wanted to help him. They repurposed a Turnitin-like software, which can evaluate plagiarism, but they retooled it to look at the works of John Locke to see what kinds of references to the King James Bible he used. So that encoding, there may be short snippets of biblical reference, but they encoded it so that the computer software could recognize this as a Bible reference, not just text. These two worked on an environmental mapping, a different portion of the land that McAllister has in the environment. So lastly, here's some tools that if you want to look at. We have something called Lynda that Bethel is subscribed to, and it has a lot of stuff. If you want to learn more about 3D modeling, web development, coding, some of these graphic design skills. That's actually, there's a variety of things you can do with that. This digital research tools has a link of all sorts of scholarly purposes you might want to use a tool for, so you can look at that. Chris Garris uses WordPress a lot. You could ask him about that. And we haven't done much, but coming out of George Mason, they created this is an exhibit software called Omeka, and a lot of digital humanities projects are facilitated through that software. The St. Paul historical one is actually built on Omeka. So. All right, so lastly, some of the skills needed. Graphic web design, manage large-scale grants, project management, choosing different tools, metadata and encoding the actual digital objects is important. So these are just some new skills or skills that are required in part of these projects. And if you're interested in the communities or how to get involved, here's some suggestions. So the syllabi that huge prominence here, what kind of projects there are. Look at the startup grants. Those are some examples of people who have successfully using their projects. The Alliance is a good resource. Hope College has a digital humanities, more like an honors cohort model, but you can look here if you want to sort of see more about that. Chris has also spoken a lot about that too. That camp is a sort of conference where people come together with some ideas for projects, but they propose them actually there. It's sort of an unconference model, but people are saying, here's a tool, here's a project I want to work on, and they kind of get, some of them might say, oh yeah, I want to look at these homework texts, and I'll work with you. So the conference generates that way. And sometimes it's regional, sometimes it's institutional. And then actually a lot of digital humanists use Twitter to sort of share news, have conversations with each other. So one of the suggestions of a digital historian is go on Twitter and see what the conversation is. But your discipline might have different media, so maybe here like art, Instagram, or the images might be in other places where social media is part of the conversation, leads to other collaborations. And then this is just if you want to look more about what the grant-funded projects look like and how they start. So the St. Paul Historical, there's actually something from the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and there's one other, but they were funded in 2011, and now they're fully functional in 2014. So. And then just for further discussion, we're kind of running out of time, but one thing the question might be, what type of community does Bethel want or need? So that's, I think, should be your discussion. And then just Chris and Sam, and I've contributed to this, but Chris put a proposal together on WordPress, sort of putting together some what digital humanities major might look like. So Sam or Chris or I somewhat contribute, but they probably have to have better knowledge of sort of the actual curriculum piece of what this would look like. So, here's my contact. And I have a bibliography. I use a web Vigo, which is sort of like Delicious or a bookmarking tool. So if you're interested, this is sort of a bibliography of things I went through today and more if you want to use that. And so that's it. Any questions? Very short, but thanks for your attention. Questions, thoughts? Thumbs up, thumbs down.
The digital maker, when you were talking about you can use traditional tools there, I was trying to sort out in what way could you...
As far as like the makerspace?
Yeah, the makerspace there.
So some of them include like sewing materials to create fabrics that you so like a glove that can work on a touchpad.
Okay.
Wearable technology.
Yeah, that's
I mean, it's just a kind of a variety of way to explore sort of how to merge the two physical objects and digital ones. The 3D printers are pretty common because people can prototype something or...
Well, that's what I was wondering, if part of that, like if you build something or create something, do you then sort of scan it as a 3D and share that or something?
Yeah, there's a whole open source directory of things people have modeled in 3 dimensions. So you could print out someone else's thing, or you can make your own with, Google has a free tool you can use, SketchUp. So there's a lot more tools now that are more accessible for the common person to try these things out, rather than having to have an engineering degree. So it sort of is making those really, which were used to be, you need a PhD to do, you can kind of try it out on a smaller scale.
That allows you to do more, actually, people can do manufacturing. There's a lot of these people now that live in order to do the factory. So it's kind of, but yeah, sometimes it includes welding, sometimes it includes just building a wooden structure.
Nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Back to your typology. Do you think digital humanities is a discipline? What's your own approach to that debate? And I was curious when you're showing the syllabi. I was curious about what departments of syllabi were in, if any of them were actually in a department of digital humanities, or if they were all kind of these various disciplines that were engaged in digital humanities.
Yeah, they're all over the map. I mean, English and history tend to be a lot. Studies tend to have them a lot. I'm not sure. I mean, in some ways, if a discipline is defined by an organization that supports a publication, community of practice, but if there is some theory, I think that's still open to discussion.
Sure.
I think what most people say, what I would probably say, I think the best way to say digital humanities is a community of practice, and it sustains. Sometimes it's interdisciplinary, sometimes it's within a discipline. I guess that's about as much of a step.
And I'd say from a student perspective is whether or not it can turn into a job is a major question. So I think it could be pretty marketable if you look at like the New York Times and their storytelling. If you have a journalism student who also has these skills, how much more marketable are they to create new media, to be problem solvers, thinkers outside the box? Those are types of things that I think people criticize this generation coming into the workplace. So if you're adding these sort of classes or these ideas into all your curriculum, it's sort of creating a different kind of student, I think, is one of the goals.
And actually, one thing, there's a blog post that I read from one of the digital historians, but he wrote about methodology versus ideology, and he talked about how even how disciplines emerge and evolve. He said, like, in the late 19th century, early 20th, methodology was a huge part of scholarship. And later, ideology became a little bit more prevalent. And he sees it shifting a little bit now with the way that computer networks work and just the tools that are available. It's shifting a little bit more back to a methodology. So I think somewhere, if we go back to the circles, I'd be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
I think that this one would need some theoretical background, but it is very practice-oriented, if that makes sense.
Maybe the concept of discipline is more modernist than postmodern anyway. That's part of the point.
Yes. Well, looks like we're out of time, so thank you guys.